Hello and welcome to ESG Hive's quick guide to ESG. We made this presentation because lots of people have heard of ESG, but most people also say they don't know what it is. If you're in that group, this guide is for you. Today we'll talk about the history of ESG, then we'll go over how ESG works, and at the end we'll highlight some really important considerations for you. Just before we start, we never offer financial advice. We're an educational community for ESG. For purely financial and investment questions, you should always consult licensed finance professionals. If you have questions about ESG, feel free to post them in the comments below and we'll get back to you. So, let's start with the brief history of ESG. The term was actually invented by the United Nations. In the early 2000s, globalization was taking off. However, there were already growing problems of corruption and worker exploitation and environmental damage in the ways that companies were doing global business. So, in late 2004, the late Secretary General of the UN, whose name was Kofi Annan, wrote to the CEOs of the world's 50 largest financial institutions, and he asked them in his letter, please take account of environmental, social, and governance issues in the way that you invest. And because of this, some people call Kofi Annan the father of ESG. Business leaders rallied to Kofi Annan's call, and since then, ESG has really taken off. Tens of thousands of businesses have signed the UN Global Compact. They make a commitment to 10 business principles that cover human rights, labor standards, environmental protections, and anti-corruption. Then in 2006, the UN and the financial services industry created the Principles for Responsible Investment. These are 6 principles for integrating ESG issues into investment practices. Over 7,000 financial firms have signed up so far. Then fast forward to 2015 and the world agreed the Paris Climate Deal. Since then, lots of companies around the world have made pledges to cut their carbon emissions by 2030. And in 2021, at the Glasgow Climate Summit, the UN and major investors started the Net Zero Alliance. Their goal is for their investment portfolios, which are worth about $100 trillion, to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Today, ESG is so big that about $30 trillion of assets are somehow aligned with or branded as ESG. So how does ESG work? Well, this is where it gets a bit more complicated because there's no single official definition of ESG. But you will commonly find these issues when people talk about ESG. The E is for environment, and obviously it's the highest profile member of the ESG family. Greenhouse gases and climate change are now the major drivers of ESG. But biodiversity, waste and pollution, and resource efficiency are also big issues for ESG investors. The major social issues tend to cover a company's impact on society. For example, does it offer good health and safety conditions? Does it offer good worker terms and conditions? How does the company impact the communities where it operates? Does it adhere to equal opportunity principles and laws? Governance is the least controversial area of ESG. Good corporate governance is well understood by business schools and financial institutions to affect companies' profitability. Some of the typical G issues that investors look for are checking that executives' pay and incentives are aligned with shareholder interests, that the company operates transparently and that it has good financial integrity, and that company directors are well qualified and that they think independently of one another. When some of these ingredients are missing, the risks of corporate scandals can go right up. However, caution. That's it. Beyond defining typical issues, ESG means different things to different people. It depends on why they care about ESG in the first place. Some people focus on ESG risks to business. They want to protect investment from excessive exposure to environmental, social, and governance risks. Meanwhile, some people focus on the ESG impacts of business. They want investments to have a positive environmental, social, or governance impact. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. Some investors want both, but you are responsible for knowing what type of ESG investments you are being offered or that you want. Why does it matter? Well, this is not simply splitting hairs. Risk and impact are not the same. A heavy polluting company can feature in many ESG indexes and ESG funds, so long as it manages ESG risk to its business very well. This company doesn't have to have a positive ESG impact to qualify to feature in many ESG products out there. You always have to read the small print and look at the investments inside an index or fund to get a good picture about whether the product is more oriented to risk or impact and whether it meets your goals. So, what are some good examples of ESG risks to business? These are also known as material risks. Well, a common example is the risk of environmental regulations to the value of oil and gas companies, or the risks of droughts to food and beverage supply chains. On the social level, people think about the risk to company reputations from poor labour conditions or human rights abuses overseas. And in the G domain, people think about the risks of shareholder litigation because of corporate scandals, or the risk of excessive risk-taking because of the corporate board structure. Any of these risks could really affect the company's bottom line. How about some common examples of ESG impact? Well, the big one is that lots of companies are making commitments to net zero or reduced greenhouse gas emissions. But they also talk a lot about minimizing waste in manufacturing. And in the food and beverages and fashion industries, they talk a lot about improving water use efficiency. On a social level, lots of companies talk about how they create employment in local communities, and they make commitments to improve labor conditions in their global supply chains, especially now there's forced labor legislation being adopted around the world. And on the G level, they often commit to pay their fair share of tax on profits, especially when they're multinational corporations with offices in many countries. And they commit to transparent lobbying policy and practice, which has been an especially big issue in the US. So, what are some typical ESG practices? Well, there are three categories of organizations that tend to work in ESG. The big one is financial institutions. They have really driven the ESG trend, especially insurance companies and pension funds. Have put a lot of pressure on financial managers to offer investment products that manage ESG risks and improve impact. Why? Well, because obviously insurers and pension funds think very long term about the problems that climate change could cause for their profits and returns. And then since then, everyday investors have also become very interested in ESG. So these days, financial institutions conduct ESG risk assessments, they use ESG ratings to build investment portfolios, they offer ESG market indexes and products such as green bonds and all different kinds of ESG funds. Right now, there are thousands of products claiming a link to ESG out there. Now, increasingly, companies also understand that their consumers, investors, and employees want to see their ESG credentials. Almost every major listed company now publishes an ESG strategy and reports. They set ESG targets and they participate in ESG initiatives in their sector. For example, the garment industry has an initiative to improve labor conditions after garment workers were killed in a factory fire in Bangladesh. And then finally, governments are also catching up. They're starting to set ESG disclosure standards to protect consumers and investors from misleading ESG claims. They offer tax incentives for ESG impact activity, especially around reducing carbon emissions, and they publish national ESG data. And the World Bank then publishes many countries' ESG statistics on their website. Now, here are some important considerations for ESG to remember. So, given all of this activity in ESG, it's become a bit of a wild west. It's up to companies to decide what aspects of ESG are important and what they want to report on or not. It's entirely voluntary. And this leads to confusion among investors and stakeholders in society generally. And there's a bit of a backlash against ESG underway in the USA. On the one hand, activists argue that there's too much greenwashing in ESG. And that's when a company or an investment product claims to be greener than it really is, simply by using the term ESG in its marketing. And then on the other hand, some American conservatives argue that ESG is just woke ideology. They reject the idea that non-financial risks and impact are important considerations for investors. Well, much of Wall Street disagrees with them about that, but as yet there's no agreed standard of ESG. So to clear up the confusion, regulators need to raise the bar for ESG definitions and uses. The EU has set disclosure standards for what is and is not sustainable and what can be described as ESG activity. And the EU will also require companies to produce scientific data to back any environmental claims. The UK and Canada are now requiring companies to make climate-related financial disclosures. For example, they should disclose financial risks from climate change and disclose a climate strategy to mitigate the risks of climate change. And the US Securities and Exchange Commission is considering introducing similar rules in the USA in 2023. In addition, the SEC may require listed companies and IPOs to publish their carbon footprints, which will be subject to quality assurance. So, what can interested individuals do in all this confusion about ESG? Well, while regulations are work in progress, it comes down to you. You have to decide what you want from an ESG product. You read the fine print, do your own research, ask lots of questions, seek professional advice, and always be on the lookout for scams. What's next? Well, we hope you enjoyed our video today. You can click on the subscribe link to follow our channel and follow us on Twitter at ESG Hive, or you can go to esghive.com for more articles and videos. If you'd like bespoke training, you can email us at info@esghive.com for options and prices. We'll see you soon for more ESG learning opportunities. Bye-bye.